Hello everyone, I'm Creepy Raindrops, and I'm here to assist you today. I know many of you use this video to unwind and fall asleep, so before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? Get cozy, relax, and let yourself drift into calm. The Midnight Hitchhiker on Route 66. It was the summer of 1998, a muggy July night in the heart of Arizona. The moon hung low, casting a dim, silvery glow over the barren expanse of Route 66. Richard Owens, a 37-year-old truck driver, was behind the wheel of his semi, hauling produce from Los Angeles to Chicago. He was used to the long stretches of desolate highway, but this particular night felt off. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty road ahead. The radio crackled with static, occasionally interrupted by snippets of old country songs that made the night feel eerier. Richard had been on the road for nearly 6 hours and decided to pull over at a small diner near Kingman for a cup of coffee before tackling the next stretch. As he got back onto the highway, the clock on his dashboard blinked 12:03 a.m. Just as he passed an old mile marker, his headlights caught a figure on the side of the road. It was a woman, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. She stood still, one arm outstretched with her thumb up. A hitchhiker. Richard hesitated. He knew picking up strangers at night wasn't the smartest idea, but something about her seemed desperate. She wore a pale sundress that fluttered in the breeze, and her long, dark hair obscured her face. The desert night was cold, and she looked out of place in the middle of nowhere. Against his better judgment, Richard slowed the truck to a stop a few feet ahead of her. He leaned over and rolled down the passenger side window. "Where you headed?" he called out. The woman approached the truck, her movements slow and deliberate. As she stepped into the beam of the headlights, Richard felt a chill run down his spine. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to pierce through him. "Anywhere but here," she said, her voice soft yet strangely echoing in the still night. Richard nodded, trying to shake off the unease. "Hop in." She climbed into the truck, settling into the passenger seat without a word. Richard noticed her bare feet were dirty, as though she'd been walking for miles. "Long night." "Huh," he said, attempting to break the silence. She turned her head slowly to look at him. Her lips curled into a faint smile, but she didn't respond. The silence in the cab was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the engine and the faint static of the radio. About 20 minutes later, as they neared a stretch of the highway known for its ghost stories, the woman finally spoke. "Have you ever heard of the Midnight Hitchhiker?" she asked, her tone calm but laced with an unsettling edge. Richard glanced at her, his grip tightening on the wheel. "Can't say I have." "Why?" She looked out the window, her voice barely above a whisper. "They say he picks up lost souls and takes them somewhere they can never leave." Richard chuckled nervously. "Sounds like one of those urban legends." The woman didn't reply. Instead, she stared into the darkness outside, her expression unreadable. Suddenly, the truck's radio crackled violently, the static louder and sharper. A distorted voice emerged, repeating the words, "Leave now." Richard's heart pounded. He reached for the radio to turn it off, but as he did, the truck's headlights flickered. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the mile markers disappearing one by one. "What's going on?" Richard muttered, his voice shaky. The woman turned to him, her face now inches from his. Her eyes, completely black, locked onto his. "You should have kept driving," she whispered. The cab filled with a bone-chilling cold, and Richard's breath fogged the air. Richard's mind raced as the chill sank deep into his bones. The steering wheel trembled beneath his hands, and the truck seemed to resist his control, veering slightly as if caught in an invisible force. What do you mean I should have kept driving?" Richard stammered, his voice barely audible over the deafening static still pouring from the radio. The woman leaned back into her seat, her black eyes unblinking. She seemed to relax, as though she had delivered the only warning she intended to give. Richard's instincts screamed at him to stop the truck and force her out, but the icy fear rooted him in place. He pressed his foot down on the accelerator, hoping speed would get him out of this surreal nightmare. The headlights flickered again, this time plunging the road ahead into complete darkness. Richard slammed the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop with a screech that echoed across the desert. He fumbled for his flashlight in the glove compartment, his shaking hands barely able to grip it. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice firmer than he felt. The woman didn't respond, her hollow gaze fixed on the windshield. Richard stepped out of the cab, the flashlight's beam cutting through the inky night. The air was unnaturally still, the usual sounds of crickets and distant coyotes replaced by an eerie silence. He walked to the front of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder of the highway. But the road was gone. Instead of the familiar asphalt, there was nothing but a swirling black void stretching endlessly in all directions. His heart pounded as he staggered backward, struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. "Impossible," he whispered. Suddenly, a faint sound reached his ears, a soft humming, almost melodic. He turned to look back at the cab, but the woman was no longer inside. The humming grew louder, coming from somewhere behind him. He spun around, the flashlight trembling in his grip. Its beam landed on the woman, now standing in the middle of the void. Her sundress fluttered in an unseen wind, and her pale skin seemed to glow faintly. "Richard," she called, her voice layered with an otherworldly resonance. He froze. How did she know his name? "I told you," she continued, her expression a mix of sorrow and menace. "You should have kept driving." Before he could respond, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. The humming grew deafening, reverberating through his chest and making his vision blur. "Let me go!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. The woman's laughter cut through the noise, a cold, hollow sound that chilled him to his core. "Richard Owens," she said, her voice now coming from all directions, "this road belongs to the lost. And tonight, so do you—" The void seemed to close in around him, the ground dissolving beneath his feet. He fell, the air rushing past him, his screams swallowed by the darkness. Richard's stomach churned as he plummeted through the blackness. He had no sense of up or down, no way to brace himself. The fall felt endless, his mind spiraling between fear and disbelief. Then suddenly it stopped. With a bone-jarring thud, Richard hit solid ground. Groaning, he pushed himself to his knees, his hands brushing against something cold and rough. Concrete. Gasping, he blinked his eyes open and saw that he was no longer on Route 66. He was in a dimly lit tunnel, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and rust. A single, flickering light bulb hung overhead, casting distorted shadows on the walls. The hum from earlier still lingered, softer now but pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. "Where am I?" Richard whispered, his voice echoing eerily down the tunnel. As he rose to his feet, the tunnel stretched infinitely in both directions. The walls were lined with old, rusted signs, road signs, speed limits, and even billboards, all riddled with scratches and dents. He reached out to touch one and recoiled. It was ice cold, as if frozen in time. "Richard," a voice called from behind him, soft but unmistakable. He whipped around, and there she was, the woman in the sundress, standing just a few feet away. Her hair hung limp around her face, and her black eyes seemed to absorb all light. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice trembling. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You picked me up," she said simply, her tone devoid of emotion. "I was trying to help," he shouted, anger bubbling through his fear. Her lips curled into a faint smile. "Help?" she repeated, almost mocking. "You can't help here. No one can." The humming grew louder again, and the tunnel began to vibrate. The signs rattled against the walls, and a low growl echoed from somewhere deep within the darkness. "What is this place?" Richard asked, backing away. She stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound against the concrete. "This is where they all end up," she said. "The ones who ignore the warnings. The ones who stop when they shouldn't." The growling grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of dragging chains. Richard's chest tightened as he looked past the woman, deeper into the tunnel. Shapes began to emerge, shadowy figures with glowing eyes, their movements slow and deliberate. "No," Richard whispered, shaking his head. "No, no, no. I didn't do anything wrong." The woman's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold detachment. "It's not about what you did," she said. "It's about what you chose." The figures advanced, their forms becoming clearer. They were grotesque, twisted versions of people. Faces stretched unnaturally, limbs bent at impossible angles. Richard turned and ran, the sound of his boots slamming against the concrete drowned out by the guttural growls and clinking chains behind him. The tunnel stretched endlessly, no matter how far he ran. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding like a drum. "Let me out!" he screamed, his voice echoing. Ahead, a faint light appeared, a pinprick of hope in the suffocating darkness. Richard pushed himself harder, his legs burning as he sprinted toward it. The growls grew closer, the shadows reaching for him, their icy touch grazing his back. As he neared the light, he saw it was a doorway, glowing with a soft, golden hue. Without hesitation, he dove through it, collapsing onto the ground on the other side. For a moment, everything was still. Richard slowly opened his eyes and found himself back in his truck. The cab was warm, the dashboard clock blinking 12:03 a.m. as if no time had passed. His heart raced as he scanned the passenger seat. It was empty. The highway stretched out ahead of him, silent and unbroken. The radio played a faint country tune, and the moonlight bathed the road in a calm, silvery glow. Was it all a dream? As he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, he glanced into the rearview mirror. There she was, sitting in the back seat, her black eyes staring into his. "Keep driving," she whispered. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He instinctively stomped on the brake, the truck screeching to a halt in the middle of the deserted highway. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and his eyes darted to the rearview mirror again. The woman was gone. "No, no, no," Richard muttered, shaking his head as if to clear it. His heart hammered in his chest, and cold sweat trickled down the back of his neck. Was he losing his mind? He reached for the bottle of water he kept in the cup holder and took a shaky sip, the liquid doing little to calm his nerves. The highway was silent, save for the distant rustling of the desert wind. Richard tried to focus, telling himself it was over, that whatever he had experienced was just some vivid hallucination caused by exhaustion. But then he heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from the back of the cab, slow and deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers against the metal. Richard froze, the bottle slipping from his hand and spilling water across the floor. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The tapping stopped. Summoning every ounce of courage he could muster, Richard unbuckled his seatbelt and climbed out of the truck. The desert air was cold and biting against his skin as he circled to the back of the vehicle. His flashlight, still in his jacket pocket, cast a shaky beam across the trailer doors. Nothing. He exhaled, relief flooding him. Maybe he really was imagining things. But just as he turned to get back into the cab, the tapping resumed. Louder this time. It was coming from inside the trailer. "No," Richard whispered, shaking his head. "No way." The sound grew more insistent, now accompanied by a faint whisper that sent chills racing down his spine. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, almost mournful. His instincts screamed at him to get back in the truck and drive, to leave whatever was happening behind. But something, a mix of curiosity and an inexplicable pull, kept him rooted in place. Hands trembling, Richard unlocked the trailer doors and swung them open. The interior was pitch black, the flashlight barely piercing the gloom. The boxes of produce were undisturbed, stacked neatly as they had been when he loaded them. But at the far end of the trailer, something moved. A figure. It was hunched over, its outline barely discernible in the dim light. "Who's there?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking. The figure straightened slowly, turning to face him. As the light hit it, Richard's stomach dropped. It was the woman. Her sundress was now tattered, her skin gray and cracked like old porcelain. Her eyes, those void-like eyes, seemed to draw all the light in the trailer toward her. She smiled, her lips peeling back to reveal teeth too sharp, too long. "Richard," she said, her voice layered with a chorus of whispers. He staggered back, dropping the flashlight. Darkness enveloped him as he scrambled to close the trailer doors, his hands fumbling with the latch. He could hear her footsteps now, slow and deliberate, growing closer with each passing second. Just as he secured the doors, something slammed against them from the inside with a force that nearly knocked him off his feet. "Richard!" The voice shrieked, no longer soft but a bone-chilling scream that echoed into the night. He bolted back to the cab, slamming the door shut and locking it. His hands shook as he fumbled to start the engine. It roared to life, and without a second thought, he floored the accelerator. The truck tore down the highway, the trailer rattling violently behind him. The screams continued, fading only slightly as he sped away. When he glanced in the rearview mirror again, the woman's face was there, impossibly close, her black eyes burning into his. "You can't run," she hissed. "Not from me." The dashboard clock blinked again, the numbers flickering wildly before settling on 12:03 a.m. Richard knew, deep down, that this nightmare was far from over. The truck barreled down the highway, the engine roaring as Richard gripped the wheel with trembling hands. The woman's voice echoed in his ears, a haunting whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You can't run, Richard," she repeated, her voice weaving into the hum of the tires on the asphalt. "You chose this road." "No," Richard muttered, his voice cracking. "I didn't choose anything." His eyes darted to the clock. It was still 12:03 a.m., frozen in time. No matter how far he drove, the road ahead seemed endless, stretching into the void. The headlights illuminated nothing but the same patch of cracked asphalt and desert sand. Suddenly, the truck jolted violently as if it had hit something. Richard's head slammed against the steering wheel, and the truck screeched to a halt. Groaning, he looked up, his vision blurry. The road was gone. The truck was now in the middle of a dense forest, the towering trees casting long, menacing shadows in the pale moonlight. The engine sputtered and died, plunging the cab into silence. "What the hell?" Richard whispered, rubbing his throbbing forehead. He reached for his flashlight again, only to find it cracked and useless. The forest around him was eerily silent, the air thick with an oppressive stillness that made his skin crawl. "Richard," Her voice came again, softer this time, almost coaxing. He turned his head slowly and saw her standing just outside the driver's side window. Her face was inches from the glass, her black eyes staring directly at him. Instinctively, he locked the doors, even though he knew it wouldn't stop her. "What do you want from me?" he yelled, his voice echoing through the cab. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "It's not about what I want," she said. "It's about what you deserve." The glass of the window began to frost over, her presence turning the air icy cold. Richard's breath came out in visible puffs as he scrambled to start the truck again. The ignition clicked, sputtered, but refused to catch. "Come out, Richard," she whispered. The door locks clicked open on their own, and the cab filled with an unnatural wind that carried the scent of decay. Richard pressed himself against the far door, his heart pounding as she climbed into the cab, her movements slow and deliberate. "Why me?" he pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "I don't understand." She leaned in closer, her cracked lips curling into a chilling smile. "You stopped," she said simply. Richard's mind raced, fragments of his life flashing before his eyes. The choices he'd made, the paths he'd taken, the warnings he'd ignored. It all seemed to converge in this moment, though he still couldn't comprehend why. The woman reached out, her cold fingers grazing his cheek. His vision blurred, the edges of his consciousness fraying like an old photograph. "You belong here now," she whispered. The world around him dissolved into darkness. When Richard opened his eyes, he was standing on the side of a road. It wasn't Route 66, but it had the same empty, desolate feel. He looked down and realized he was barefoot, dressed in tattered clothes he didn't recognize. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they approached. Desperation surged in his chest. He raised his hand, sticking out his thumb. As the vehicle slowed, a sense of déjà vu washed over him. The driver rolled down the window, a young man, maybe in his 20s, with a friendly smile. "Need a lift?" the driver asked. Richard hesitated, his throat dry. He wanted to warn the man, to tell him to drive away and never look back. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded and climbed into the passenger seat. The cycle had begun again. The young driver adjusted his rearview mirror, giving Richard a friendly glance as he pulled back onto the road. The hum of the car engine filled the silence, a comforting rhythm against the oppressive quiet of the endless stretch of highway. "Where you headed, buddy?" the driver asked, his tone casual, almost oblivious to the strangeness of the situation. Richard stared out the window, his mind swimming in a fog of dread and confusion. The trees lining the road seemed to shift unnaturally, their shadows elongating in the pale glow of the headlights. "Anywhere but here," Richard finally muttered, echoing the words the woman had once said to him. The driver chuckled. "Well, I'm heading to Amarillo. You're welcome to ride along if that works for you." Richard didn't answer. His hands clenched into fists as he fought against the rising panic in his chest. He knew this wasn't over. The woman's presence still lingered, a cold weight pressing down on him. "Hey, you okay?" the driver asked, his brows furrowing. Richard turned to him, his eyes hollow. "You need to stop the car," he said, his voice low and urgent. The driver laughed nervously. "Stop? We're in the middle of nowhere. Man, what's going on?" "Stop the car," Richard repeated, his tone more forceful. Before the driver could respond, the car's radio crackled to life. Static filled the cabin, followed by a faint, distorted voice. "Leave, now." The driver's face paled. "What the hell is that?" Richard didn't answer. His gaze shifted to the rearview mirror, where he caught a glimpse of her. She was sitting in the back seat, her black eyes staring directly at him. "She's here," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. The driver glanced in the mirror, his expression turning to confusion and then horror as he saw her reflection. He slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the road. Who is that? The driver stammered, his voice shaking. Get out of the car, Richard yelled, fumbling with his door handle. But before either of them could move, the temperature in the cabin plummeted. Frost crept across the windows, and the woman's voice filled the air, a haunting melody that seemed to echo from everywhere at once. You can't leave, she said, her tone almost playful. Not now. The headlights flickered, casting fleeting shadows across her face as she leaned forward, her twisted smile revealing too many teeth. The driver screamed, scrambling to unlock his door, but it wouldn't budge. The locks clicked shut, trapping them inside. Please, the driver begged, his eyes wide with terror. What do you want? The woman tilted her head, her gaze shifting between them. Only what's owed, she said, her voice layered with an unearthly resonance. The car began to shake violently, the engine revving and sputtering on its own. Richard clutched the dashboard, his mind racing. He had to do something, anything, to stop this. Let him go, Richard shouted, turning to face her. Take me instead. The woman's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with a sinister light. You don't understand, Richard, she said. You've already given yourself to me. But she extended a pale, clawed finger toward the driver. He's a gift. The car plunged into darkness, the screams of both men swallowed by the void. When Richard opened his eyes again, the first thing he noticed was the silence. No hum of tires on asphalt, no creak of the car, and no sound of the wind. The darkness was absolute, pressing against him like a living thing. He wasn't in the car anymore. The air around him was thick and cold, the kind of cold that seeped into his bones. He struggled to his feet, his legs shaky as he tried to orient himself. Gradually, a faint light emerged, a dim, sickly green glow that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. He was in a vast, cavernous space. The walls were jagged and uneven, covered with strange, flickering symbols that seemed to writhe when he looked directly at them. Shadows moved in the periphery of his vision, though when he turned, nothing was there. Hello, he called out, his voice echoing endlessly. From the darkness, a familiar voice answered. Richard. He spun around, and there she was. The woman stood a few feet away, her sundress now torn and soaked with some dark, unidentifiable substance. Her face was no longer human, her features twisted into something monstrous, elongated, skeletal, with those same haunting black eyes. You brought him here, she said, her voice resonating unnaturally. Richard's heart sank. The driver, where is he? What did you do to him? She tilted her head, her smile cold and detached. He's with us now, she said, gesturing toward the shadows. As if on cue, the shapes in the darkness began to move. One stepped into the faint green light, its form twisted and grotesque. It was the driver, but not as Richard remembered. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale and cracked, and his mouth moved silently as though trying to scream, but no sound escaped. No, Richard whispered, backing away. This isn't real. The woman laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. It's as real as your choices, Richard, she said. This is where they all come. Everyone who ignores the warnings. Everyone who takes what they shouldn't. I didn't do anything, Richard shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. You stopped, she hissed, her voice growing louder, filling the cavern. You stopped when you were told to drive. You ignored the signs, and now you're part of the road. The ground beneath him began to shift, the symbols glowing brighter and spreading like veins across the floor. Richard tried to run, but the shadows rose up around him, pulling him down. "No, please," he screamed, clawing at the ground as the darkness swallowed him. The last thing he saw was the woman's face, her smile wide and merciless. "You belong to me now," she whispered. Somewhere on Route 66, a lone truck driver spotted a figure standing on the side of the road. A man, barefoot and ragged, his hand raised in a silent plea for a ride. The truck slowed, and the driver rolled down his window. "Need some help?" The man looked up, his eyes hollow, his voice barely audible. "Please, don't stop." But the driver didn't listen, and the cycle began again. As the new driver pulled his truck to a stop, he leaned out the window, studying the ragged figure standing by the roadside. "Hey, buddy, you look like you've been through hell. Need a lift?" The man, Richard, didn't respond immediately. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, as if the weight of an eternity rested behind them. He stared at the driver, lips trembling as though fighting to speak. "Please," he finally rasped, his voice hoarse. "Don't stop." The driver frowned. "What are you talking about? You need help, man. I can't just leave you out here." "No," Richard whispered, stepping closer to the truck. "You don't understand. You have to keep driving. Don't stop, no matter what you see." The driver leaned back, unease flickering across his face. "Look, if you need help, I can take you to the next town. But if not, I can't just leave you out here." Before Richard could protest, the truck door unlocked with a soft click. Richard froze, his chest tightening. The air around him grew colder, and the familiar sound of distant whispers began to rise. "She's coming," he muttered, his eyes wide with terror. The driver looked around nervously. "Who's coming? What are you talking about?" Richard's gaze snapped to the horizon. The darkened road ahead seemed to ripple, the shadows twisting unnaturally. He turned back to the driver, desperation etched into his face. "You need to leave," Richard shouted. "Now!" But it was too late. The headlights flickered, their beams dimming as the whispers grew louder, closer. The truck's radio crackled to life, emitting bursts of static and faint, distorted voices. "Who's there?" the driver demanded, his voice shaking. A figure appeared in the middle of the road, illuminated by the dim light. She stood motionless, her head tilted slightly to the side, her sundress fluttering in the non-existent breeze. "Do you see her?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. The driver nodded slowly, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Yeah, I see her." "Then it's too late for you," Richard said, stepping back from the truck. The woman began to move, gliding toward the vehicle with an unnerving grace. The driver's instincts screamed at him to flee, but his hands refused to obey. "Drive!" Richard shouted, slamming his fists against the side of the truck. "You still have a chance." The driver finally snapped out of his trance, slamming his foot on the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, the woman's figure growing smaller in the rearview mirror. But as he sped away, his relief was short-lived. The whispers didn't fade. When he glanced in the mirror again, her face was there, her black eyes staring back at him. "You can't outrun me," she said softly. Richard stood motionless on the side of the road, watching as the truck disappeared into the distance. The cold wind swept through the desert, carrying with it the faint echo of the woman's voice. He knew what would happen next. The driver would face her, just as he had, and the cycle would begin anew. For Richard, there was no escape. He was bound to this cursed stretch of Route 66, a warning for all who dared to stop. And somewhere in the distance, another vehicle approached, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The trucker drove as fast as he could, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. His mind raced with fragments of the strange encounter. A disheveled man begging him not to stop, the eerie woman on the road, and her haunting eyes in the rearview mirror. The whispers were growing louder, filling the cab with an otherworldly resonance. They were not words but a cacophony of sounds that gnawed at his sanity. "Get out of my head!" he shouted, slamming his palm against the dashboard. But the whispers didn't stop. They coiled around him like tendrils, pulling his thoughts into chaos. He glanced again in the rearview mirror, but this time, she wasn't there. Relief flooded him, but it was fleeting. The road ahead began to change. The familiar stretch of Route 66 twisted, its straight path warping into a serpentine maze of jagged turns and darkened voids. The headlights seemed dimmer now, barely illuminating a few feet ahead. Shadows darted across the edges of his vision, impossible to focus on. "This isn't real," the driver muttered, his voice shaking. The radio crackled again, and a distorted version of his own voice echoed through the static. "Keep driving. Don't stop. Keep driving. Don't." He shut the radio off with a trembling hand, but the words persisted, whispered from nowhere and everywhere. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. The driver swerved violently, the truck skidding to the side and coming to a screeching halt. His heart pounded as he sat frozen, gripping the wheel. When he looked up, the figure was standing just outside the windshield. It was Richard. "You can't outrun her," Richard said, his voice hollow. "No one can. Get away from me," the driver yelled, fumbling for his door handle. Richard didn't move. His eyes were glassy, his face pale, and his voice carried the weight of inevitability. "She'll take you. It's only a matter of time." The driver's resolve broke. He threw the truck into reverse, the engine roaring as he tried to back away from the spectral figure. But the moment he looked into the rearview mirror, he saw her again, sitting in the back seat, her black eyes piercing into his. "Why are you running?" she asked, her voice calm, almost amused. The driver screamed, jerking the wheel and sending the truck spinning out of control. It veered off the road, crashing into the desert sands with a deafening thud. The airbag deployed, slamming into his chest and leaving him gasping for breath. The whispers faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. He opened his eyes, his vision blurry, and saw her standing outside the shattered windshield. "You should have listened," she said softly, reaching through the broken glass. Her hand was icy, and as it touched his skin, a wave of darkness engulfed him. Back on Route 66, Richard stood motionless, watching the aftermath of the crash. The truck was gone, swallowed by the night, and the road was silent once more. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they approached. Richard sighed, the weight of eternity heavy on his shoulders. He raised his hand, sticking out his thumb. As the headlights grew closer, Richard's breath hitched. The truck would stop. It always stopped. It was part of the endless cycle, a cycle he had come to understand far too well. His hand remained outstretched, the subtle pull of inevitability drawing the next victim in. The truck slowed as it approached, the driver's face obscured by the glare of the headlights. Richard could see the man's silhouette behind the wheel, a lone figure driving through the desolation of Route 66, just as he had done countless times before. The truck came to a halt beside him. The driver rolled down the window, leaning out to speak. "Hey, buddy, you need a ride?" Richard didn't respond immediately. His eyes were distant, hollow. His voice felt like it came from another lifetime, a far-off echo of the man he used to be. "Just keep driving," Richard said quietly. "Don't stop." The driver raised an eyebrow, clearly confused. "What? Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost or something." Richard's heart raced as the air around him grew heavier, thicker. The familiar cold began to creep up his spine, the whispering voices growing louder, coming from all directions. He could feel her presence again, the woman. "You don't understand," Richard muttered, his hands shaking as he stepped closer to the truck. "She'll take you if you stop. Please just keep going. Don't let her near you." The driver looked at him with growing concern, but his curiosity got the better of him. "I'm not leaving you out here. Just get in, I'll take you to the next town." Richard knew it was too late. He had seen this before. He had been here before. It was inevitable. The woman would always find them, and the cycle would never break. "Don't!" Richard screamed, slamming his hand against the side of the truck. "You can't outrun her." The trucker looked around, uneasy. The atmosphere was shifting, the air becoming thick with an unnatural cold. What the hell is going on? And then it happened. A shadow flickered in the distance, too fast for the human eye to follow. Richard turned toward it just in time to see the woman emerging from the darkness, her figure gliding toward them with an unnatural grace. Her face was twisted, her eyes dark as pitch, and her mouth stretched into a grin that seemed far too wide for any human being. "Get in!" the driver shouted, panic rising in his voice, but his hands had frozen on the steering wheel. The woman's voice, cold and echoing, pierced the night air. "You can't run from me." Richard reached for the door handle, desperate to get away, but the doors would not open. He pressed himself against the side of the truck, his heart racing, his thoughts wild with fear. But the woman's grip was already upon him. He felt her icy touch on his arm, pulling him into the darkness. The driver screamed as the truck's engine sputtered and died, the headlights flickering and finally going out. The truck lurched forward, moving on its own, and then nothing. Richard felt the ground beneath him vanish. He was falling. Through the blackness, he heard the woman's voice again, softer now, like a lullaby. "You belong to me, Richard, just like the others." And then he understood. The woman wasn't just a ghost, a vengeful spirit. She was the manifestation of the curse that haunted Route 66, an entity bound to the road, to the endless cycle of souls who stopped and couldn't escape. The truck, their souls were now part of the cursed road, forever bound to the woman's will. As Richard fell deeper into the darkness, his mind fractured, and his body became cold. He realized that he, too, would become a part of the legend of Route 66. The next driver would come, the next victim would arrive, and the curse would continue. And somewhere, far ahead, another pair of headlights gleamed in the distance. As the darkness wrapped around Richard, he felt an overwhelming sense of cold. It was like sinking into an abyss with no end, no hope for escape. The road, no, the highway, seemed endless, stretching out in front of him, yet it was all distorted and disjointed, like the broken fragments of a nightmare. The whispers that had plagued him earlier now roared around him, their voices a chorus of countless lost souls, all trapped within the curse of Route 66. The woman, or whatever she was, loomed over him, her form flickering in and out of existence like a haunting mirage. She was more than just a ghost. She was the embodiment of the road's tragedy, a force that fed on the lost, the unsuspecting travelers who dared to stop. "You'll never escape," she whispered, her voice a mixture of sweet promises and cruel mockery. "This is your new home now, Richard. Welcome to the family." The weight of her words sank deep into his chest. The road he had once known, with its familiar landmarks and stretches of flat desert, had now transformed into an endless loop of torment. He wasn't just part of the story anymore, he was the story. He was the warning, the tragedy that the next traveler would see on the side of the road. As he looked around, he saw fragments of the souls that had come before him. They were there, scattered across the landscape, their faces twisted in horror and sorrow. Some tried to move, to run, but the road held them fast. They were as much a part of the highway now as the cracked asphalt and the fading road signs. The woman stepped closer to him, her shadow swallowing the light. "You're mine now," she said, her smile stretching even wider, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "And soon you'll be the one calling out to them." Richard's heart pounded in his chest, the realization sinking in with painful clarity. He had become the very thing he had feared, the warning on the side of the road, the hitchhiker who could never escape. And the cycle would never end. Another driver would come. Another soul would be lost. The air grew colder still, and Richard felt his body grow heavier, his limbs frozen in place. His consciousness began to fade, slipping into the darkness, but just before it did, he heard the unmistakable sound of an engine. A truck, a car, whatever it was, approaching. He knew what would happen next. The next traveler, just like him, would make the same mistake. They would stop. They would get in. The headlights grew brighter as the truck slowly approached, cutting through the thick desert night. In the distance, Richard's faded, shadowed figure lingered on the edge of the highway, his face now twisted into an empty, hollow stare. His soul, broken and bound to the cursed road, had begun to take on the characteristics of the others trapped here. His body now more spectral than human, an eternal warning. The truck came to a slow stop beside him. The driver, a young man, barely in his 20s with dark, unruly hair and tired eyes, looked out at Richard. He had been driving for hours, seeking solace in the empty stretches of Route 66. The vastness of the desert was supposed to be comforting, but something about this night felt different. Something about this stretch of the highway seemed off. The man rubbed his eyes, exhaustion clouding his vision as he gazed at the figure standing by the road. "Hey, you need a lift?" The words spilled out without thinking, a habit formed after years of driving long haul. Richard didn't answer at first. He stared, his hollow eyes locked on the driver, his mouth twitching slightly as if he wanted to say something, but no sound came. The air around him was unnaturally still. Even the wind had stopped, as if the world itself held its breath. The young driver frowned. "You okay?" For a moment, Richard seemed to almost snap out of his trance. He shifted on his feet, then whispered hoarsely, "Don't stop. Please, don't stop." The trucker squinted, confused, but curiosity tugged at him. "What? Why?" he asked, a hint of impatience creeping into his voice. But Richard's eyes were wide now, his lips trembling as he took a step closer to the truck. She's coming. You have to keep driving," Richard gasped, his voice cracking. "Don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop." The trucker's breath caught in his throat. The tone, the desperation in Richard's voice. It was a warning that felt far too real. But the driver couldn't understand why. He'd heard stories before, tales about the cursed stretch of Route 66, but they were just that, stories. Urban legends. Nothing more. "I'm not leaving you out here," the driver said, his voice firm, but there was doubt lingering in the back of his mind. He looked at Richard for another moment, then reached over to unlock the passenger door. "Get in. It'll be okay." Richard's face twisted, a desperate horror flashing across his features. "No, you don't understand." His voice grew louder, panicked. "She'll take you. She'll—" Suddenly, the woman appeared. The air grew freezing cold in an instant. The temperature dropped so sharply that the trucker's breath came out in visible plumes. He slammed his foot down on the accelerator instinctively, but the truck didn't move. The engine sputtered and died. Before he could react, the woman was standing there, right beside the truck. The night seemed to warp around her, the world distorting in ways the trucker couldn't comprehend. Her eyes were black, empty, unfeeling. Her smile was stretched far too wide. And her presence, she was not a human, not a ghost. She was something far older, far more terrifying. The trucker froze in fear, unable to speak, unable to breathe. His body went stiff, as though every muscle had been paralyzed by the sheer force of her presence. She leaned toward him, her face only inches from his, her voice low and chilling. "You didn't listen," she whispered, her breath cold against his face. "Now you'll join them, just like him." Richard, standing motionless by the side of the road, watched as the woman's shadow engulfed the truck. His own voice, a broken echo, seemed to carry across the darkness. "You'll be a part of the road now," Richard murmured, his voice distant, almost resigned. "Just another lost soul, bound here forever." The trucker's eyes widened with terror as he saw Richard's form shifting, becoming less human, more like the other tortured souls trapped along this endless highway. The woman raised her hand, her fingers cold and skeletal, and the trucker screamed as his body was pulled toward her. No matter how hard he struggled, he was helpless against her grip. The woman's form blurred, and as his mind began to unravel, he understood. This road, this cursed stretch of Route 66, was not just a place, it was a prison. Prison for the lost, for the foolish souls who had stopped, who had made the mistake of crossing paths with the woman. And now he too was trapped. The cycle had begun again. The trucker's scream faded into the endless night. And as the road stretched on, the next headlights appeared in the distance, another traveler unknowingly approaching the cursed spot. As the headlights of the approaching vehicle pierced the darkness, the atmosphere around the cursed stretch of Route 66 seemed to grow heavier, thicker with anticipation. The night was alive with the whispering voices of the lost souls, their words faint but chilling, carried on the wind that never seemed to stop. The truck had vanished, swallowed by the dark void of the highway, its new occupant now bound to the road, as Richard had been. His body, now just another shadow in the endless night, disappeared into the desert. The next vehicle, a sleek sedan, sped toward the spot where the curse had claimed yet another victim. Inside, a young woman named Emma hummed along to the radio, her eyes focused on the road. She had just finished a long day of work and was making her way to her parents' house for the weekend. The long drive had been tiring, but she welcomed the solitude. As she drove, she noticed something strange in the distance, a faint light that seemed to flicker in and out. At first, she thought it was just her tired eyes playing tricks on her, but as she drew closer, she saw it. A figure standing on the side of the road. She slowed the car, her curiosity piqued. As she got nearer, she saw the figure more clearly. It was a man, disheveled and unkempt, standing still in the middle of nowhere. His clothes were tattered, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes locked onto hers, and she felt a sudden chill run down her spine. She stopped the car, unsure of what to do. "Hey!" she called out, rolling down the window, her voice carrying an odd mix of concern and caution. "Are you okay?" The man's eyes were hollow, his expression vacant. Slowly, he moved toward the car, his gaze never leaving hers. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't stop. Keep driving." Emma frowned, confused. "What? Why? Are you in trouble?" she asked, her concern growing. "I can take you somewhere." "No," he said sharply, his voice suddenly more desperate. "You don't understand. You can't stop. If you stop, you'll—" But before he could finish, the car door suddenly rattled, as if someone, or something, was trying to open it from the outside. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She looked up and saw the faint figure of a woman in the darkness, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light of the headlights. Emma's heart began to race. The woman stood there, still and motionless, her face hidden by the shadows, but Emma could feel her presence as if she were standing right next to her. A cold, suffocating presence that sent a shiver down her spine. "Get out of here!" the man suddenly screamed, his voice raw with fear. "Don't let her touch you. Drive. Please just drive." Emma's hands shook as she reached for the gear shift, but her mind was in turmoil. She didn't understand what was happening. This was just some crazy person, right? Some poor soul stranded out here. But the fear in his voice, it sounded so real. The woman in the distance moved closer, her figure growing more solid with each step, her eyes now visible in the darkness. They were black, empty voids, and as she approached the car, the temperature plummeted, the air thickening with an unnatural chill. Emma's foot slammed on the gas pedal, the engine roaring to life as the car surged forward. But as she glanced in the rearview mirror, her heart stopped. The woman wasn't behind her. Instead, she was sitting in the back seat. Her eyes locked onto Emma's through the mirror, a twisted, horrifying grin spreading across her face. Emma screamed, her hand gripping the wheel tightly as she sped down the road, but the woman didn't move. She was there, in the back seat, an unrelenting force that wouldn't be shaken. "No, no, no," Emma whispered frantically, trying to force herself to wake up from this nightmare. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. The road ahead began to blur, as if the world itself was being pulled into some other dimension. The lights of the car flickered, then went out entirely, plunging Emma into darkness. The woman's voice, low and haunting, echoed through the car. "You shouldn't have stopped," she whispered. "Now you're mine." Emma slammed on the brakes, but it was no use. The road had disappeared. The car was no longer moving. She could feel the cold fingers of the woman tightening around her throat, the weight of her presence overwhelming. And then, as Emma's consciousness began to slip away, she heard the final whisper, a sound that would haunt her forever. "Welcome to Route 66. The highway was silent once again, the darkness pressing in on every side. The woman, her job complete, faded back into the shadows, her figure dissolving into the void. Another soul was lost. Another soul would never be seen again. And somewhere in the distance, the first flicker of headlights appeared. Would the next traveler heed the warnings of those who came before? Or would they, too, make the mistake of stopping on this cursed road, becoming just another part of the endless cycle that haunted Route 66? The road would always call, always wait, and the woman would always answer. The endless cycle of Route 66 continued, and the road itself seemed to wait, silent and patient, like a predator lying in ambush. Its vast, lonely expanse was both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where the lost souls were bound forever. Days blurred into nights, and nights bled into endless stretches of time. Each soul that passed through the cursed highway became part of its twisted story, one that would continue for eternity. But there were others, those who were aware of the curse, those who had heard the stories, and even those who had witnessed the horrors firsthand. They were the ones who tried to warn the new travelers, to save them from the fate that awaited them. And there was one who, like Richard before him, had been marked by the woman and yet still fought to break free. It was a cold, moonless night when Noah, a seasoned truck driver, found himself driving the same stretch of Route 66. He had been driving this road for years, delivering goods to small towns and large cities alike. To him, the highway was nothing more than a job, another road to travel, another destination to reach. But tonight, something felt different. Noah had heard the stories about the strange happenings on Route 66. The eerie disappearances, the ghostly figures, the man who had tried to warn travelers, only to vanish without a trace. But he had always dismissed them as just stories. Until now, as he drove deeper into the desert, his truck's headlights flickered, a momentary glitch. He checked the dashboard and frowned. Nothing was wrong with the engine, but the unsettling feeling only grew stronger. The road ahead stretched out like an endless abyss. And then he saw it, the figure on the side of the road. A man, standing motionless in the darkness, his clothes torn, his skin pale. Noah's foot instinctively pressed harder on the gas pedal, but the truck slowed as he neared the figure. Something inside him, a strange sense of urgency, made him stop. The figure moved closer, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes distant. It was Richard. Noah's breath caught in his throat. He recognized him from the stories, the warning, the man who had been swallowed by the road. Richard's face, once human, was now a hollow mask of fear and despair, his form flickering like a mirage. "Don't stop," Richard rasped, his voice cracking with urgency. "You don't understand. She'll take you. You can't stop." Noah's heart pounded. He had heard this before, but now, standing face to face with the ghost of Route 66, the words felt different. "Real. What are you talking about?" Noah asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Who's going to take me?" Richard's eyes widened, a frantic look crossing his face. "She's coming. She always comes. You have to keep driving. Don't stop." The air around Noah grew unnaturally cold, and he shivered. He looked behind him, instinctively glancing over his shoulder, but saw nothing in the rearview mirror. It was just the emptiness of the desert night. But Richard's fear was palpable, and it gripped Noah's heart. "Please," Richard continued, his voice pleading now. "If you stop, if you let her in, it's over." Noah's mind raced. He had heard the stories, but it was just too unbelievable. A ghost? A curse? A woman who could pull souls into the highway? None of it made sense. Then it happened. The woman appeared. She emerged from the darkness, her form taking shape as though she were materializing from the very air itself. Her skin was pale, nearly translucent, her hair long and dark like a river of night. Her eyes, empty, black pits, locked onto Noah's, and in that instant, he felt the weight of her presence, a cold that froze him to the bone. Richard's scream was lost in the night as the woman reached out, her fingers stretching, her grip an icy vice. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The very sight of her was enough to paralyze Noah, to strip him of any hope of escape. Noah tried to move, but his body felt as if it had turned to stone. The woman's eyes bore into him, her gaze pulling at something deep inside him, something primal, something that told him he would never leave this place. He could hear Richard's voice, weak and desperate. "You shouldn't have stopped." The words echoed in Noah's mind as the woman stepped closer, her fingers now brushing the side of the truck. He couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. It was as if the air had been stolen from him. Then, as the woman's cold fingers touched the door handle, something inside Noah snapped. A surge of adrenaline flooded his veins. With a force of will he didn't know he had, he slammed his foot onto the gas pedal, roaring down the highway. The truck jolted forward, the engine screaming in protest, but Noah didn't dare look back. The woman's laughter rang out in the stillness, a sound that chilled him to the core. He could feel her presence lingering, just beyond the reach of his rearview mirror, her eyes watching him, waiting for him to slip up. Noah didn't dare stop. He couldn't. Not until he was far away, out of her reach. But the road ahead was changing. The asphalt seemed to twist and bend unnaturally. the lines on the road warping like a fever dream. The headlights illuminated nothing but a dark, endless tunnel that stretched out into eternity. And in that darkness, the woman's shadow followed him, always just a few steps behind. Noah's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white from the pressure. The truck roared down the road, but no matter how fast he drove, the world around him seemed to distort and warp. The darkness ahead became thicker, the lines on the road twisting and blurring. It was as though the very fabric of reality was bending under the weight of the curse that clung to Route 66. He could still hear the woman's laugh echoing in the air, a sound that felt like cold fingers scraping against his spine. The chill in the air seemed to deepen with every mile, every moment. Noah's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he pressed harder on the accelerator, his eyes glued to the road ahead. But it was no use. The truck's headlights barely cut through the growing darkness, and with each passing second, the world around him felt like it was slipping further away. The endless desert stretched on, but the road ahead was shifting, changing, becoming a labyrinth that he could not navigate. Then suddenly the road disappeared. Noah slammed on the brakes, but the truck did not slow down. Instead, it barreled forward, as if being pulled by an invisible force. He fought with the wheel, struggling to control the vehicle, but it was hopeless. The road had vanished entirely, and in its place, there was only a void, an endless blackness that swallowed everything around him. His pulse raced as the truck hurtled into the abyss. And then, just as he thought they would crash into nothingness, the truck jolted to a stop. The engine sputtered and died, leaving Noah in a suffocating silence. He sat there, panting, his heart thundering in his chest. The air around him was eerily still, and the cold had returned in full force. The darkness was absolute, and for a moment, Noah wondered if he had been swallowed entirely by the curse, if he was now part of the endless stretch of road that would never end. But then he heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, so soft he thought it might be his imagination. But it grew louder, clearer, until it was unmistakable. "Welcome to Route 66. Noah's blood ran cold as he turned his head. There, standing outside the truck, was the woman. She was close now, so close he could feel her icy breath on his face. Her eyes were black, like endless pits, and her smile was twisted, grotesque. "You didn't listen," she whispered, her voice low and silky, laced with malice. "Now you'll join them." Noah opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His body refused to move. The woman's cold fingers brushed the window, and in that instant he understood. There was no escaping her. No escaping Route 66. Once you entered, you were trapped. Forever. The darkness around him thickened, and the truck began to fade, along with everything else. Noah's world collapsed into the void. The woman's laugh echoed through the nothingness as the truck, along with its driver, was absorbed into the endless curse of the highway. And so the cycle continued. The lost souls of Route 66 remained trapped in its grip, forever bound to the road that never ended. Richard, Emma, Noah, they were all now part of the endless procession, their faces forever haunting the stretch of highway that wound its way through the desert. Somewhere in the distance, the faint glow of headlights appeared, signaling the next unsuspecting traveler, the next soul to be drawn into the curse. They would stop, they would listen, and they, too, would join the growing army of the lost. Route 66 was not just a road. It was a prison, a place where time stood still, and where the woman, a dark force that fed on the lost, waited patiently for her next victim. The cursed stretch of Route 66 stretched on forever, an eternal ribbon of asphalt winding through the desert, forever haunted by the souls it had claimed. The headlights of another vehicle appeared on the horizon, slowly drawing closer, unaware of the fate that awaited. Inside the car, a young man named Jacob was humming along to his favorite song on the radio. He had just finished a weekend getaway, enjoying a quiet retreat in the mountains, and now he was making his way home, eager to return to his normal life. The road seemed endless, but that was typical for this stretch of Route 66. He had heard the stories, of course, the ones about ghosts and strange happenings, but Jacob had always been a skeptic, never one to believe in such things. As he drove, the night deepened, and the air grew colder. The glow of the headlights sliced through the darkness, casting long shadows across the road. He felt a slight chill, but it wasn't anything unusual. It was the desert, after all. But then he saw her. At first, she was just a shadow on the side of the road, a figure standing motionless in the darkness. As he drew closer, the shape became clearer. A woman, pale as death, standing still in the middle of nowhere. Her long black hair swayed in the wind, but her face remained hidden in the shadows. Jacob slowed the car, his curiosity piqued. Maybe she needed help. Maybe she was just stranded. He rolled down his window, preparing to offer assistance. But then she moved. The woman's head turned toward him, her eyes glowing dark as midnight. There was nothing human about them, only emptiness, a void. Her smile twisted, unnatural, as though she had been waiting for him. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. "Are you okay?" he called out, his voice shaky. He was no longer sure if helping her was a good idea. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, her feet moving silently across the road, closing the distance between them. And then she spoke. Her voice was a chilling whisper that seemed to cut through the air, sending a cold shiver down Jacob's spine. "You shouldn't have stopped." Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to drive away, to escape, but his body wouldn't respond. He was frozen, locked in place by the woman's dark gaze. Her fingers twitched, as though they were beckoning him. "Please," she continued, her voice a low hiss. "You're mine now, just like the others." Suddenly, the air around him grew impossibly cold. Jacob's breath fogged up the window, and the world outside seemed to darken. The headlights flickered, casting brief shadows that danced wildly across the road. He could hear something faint, distant, whispers, voices, all overlapping, coming from the void. "Get away from me!" Jacob shouted, desperately trying to start the car. But it was too late. The engine sputtered and died, and the car rolled to a stop. The woman was closer now, only inches away from his window. He could smell the decay on her breath, the cold, the death that clung to her. Her black eyes bore into his soul, and the weight of her gaze crushed him, paralyzed him. "You shouldn't have stopped," she repeated, her voice now a shrill scream that echoed in his mind. Without thinking, Jacob threw open the door and ran. His legs moved before his mind could catch up. He dashed into the desert, the dry sand crunching beneath his feet, the darkness swallowing him whole. Behind him, the woman followed, her presence looming, suffocating, drawing closer with every step. But no matter how fast he ran, no matter how much the world seemed to shift and distort around him, he couldn't escape. The woman was always just a few steps behind, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. He turned, gasping for breath, but saw only the desert stretching out in every direction. The road, the car, the woman, they were all gone. Only the blackness remained, pressing in on him from all sides. The air grew thicker, colder, and the whispers came again. Voices from the past, voices of those who had walked this cursed road before him. Richard, Emma, Noah, all the souls who had fallen prey to the woman and her curse. They were all here, trapped in the endless night. Jacob collapsed to the ground, his body too weak to continue. his vision blurred, his thoughts unraveling. And then, the woman was standing before him once more, her cold fingers reaching out to touch his face. "You'll be here forever," she whispered, her smile stretching impossibly wide. The last thing Jacob saw before his mind faded into darkness was the faint glow of headlights in the distance. Another traveler, another soul about to make the same mistake he had. And the cycle continued. Route 66 remained, its stretch of cursed highway winding endlessly through the desert. Each new soul that wandered down its path was destined to become part of the unending story, trapped by the woman who had once been its guardian, now its eternal warden. Her hunger for souls would never cease. The whispers of the lost would continue to echo through the desert, reaching the ears of anyone foolish enough to stop. And the highway, as always, would wait for its next victim.